The first thing the medic checked was the boots. That's what you did after a long patrol. Feet, joints, hydration. On any other night, it would have taken about 4 minutes. On this night, there was nothing else to check. No shrapnel, no abrasions, no powder burns. 4 men had walked into a section of northern Bakuba that American command had declared operationally dead 9 months earlier. 4 men had walked out of it 4 hours later. None of them had a mark on them worth writing down. The building they had crossed the grid to reach was roughly 800 meters from the forward edge of their own lines. It had been 800 meters from American lines for most of the year. No ground unit had been inside it since February. 3 separate attempts to push through the surrounding streets had cost the Americans 12 dead and 1 Bradley. The district had been given an informal name inside Forward Operating Base Warhorse, the Black Quarter, and a very specific line on the Joint Operations Overlay, hatched in red, behind which no friendly element was permitted to move. The 4 men had moved behind that line on foot at night, without air cover, without quick reaction backup, and without authorization from the American task force commander whose sector it was. They had come back with an intact prisoner. The prisoner's name was Abu Dari al-Samarai. He had been on a joint priority targets list for 14 months. He was, as of 0430 on the 9th of October, 2007, sitting on a camp chair outside a plywood interrogation cell at FOB Warhorse with a bottle of water and a cable tie on his wrists, and the dull expression of a man who still did not quite understand what had happened to him. 9 weeks earlier, Colonel Bradley Heston, who commanded the American task force that owned that sector, had sat at the head of a briefing room table at the same base and said something specific about the Black Quarter. He had said it in front of 14 officers. He had said it clearly enough that the officer keeping the meeting log wrote it down twice. The exact phrasing, which he had used about the British proposal to enter the district on foot, was this: "Nothing can survive in there. That scene will be delivered in full." First, the room has to be understood. What the 14 officers in that briefing room did not know, and what Colonel Heston did not know for another 71 days, was that one of the men sitting quietly along the far wall had already been into the Black Quarter. Not once, 6 times. On foot. Alone. At night. Over the course of the 3 weeks before the briefing. He had not reported it. He was not going to report it. The question he had come to the meeting to answer was not whether entry into the grid was possible. That question had been resolved in private, on his own feet, several weeks earlier. The question was whether the Americans would let him do it officially. Bakuba in the autumn of 2007 was, by every measure available to American command, one of the worst places in Iraq, capital of Diyala province, population before the war, somewhere near 270,000. Population in September of 2007, nobody at task force level was willing to guess. The city had been one of the original strongholds of al-Qaeda in Iraq during 2006, and it had been one of the primary objectives of the summer offensive known as Arrowhead Ripper, which had cleared much of it by July. Much of it, not all of it. The 14 blocks that composed what American officers called the Black Quarter sat in the northern part of the city, between 2 canals, bordered on the west by a stretch of collapsed industrial buildings, and on the east by a stretch of farmland nobody had harvested in a year. The district had not been cleared in July. The district had not been cleared in August. The district, by the end of September, had not been cleared at all. The reason was in the ground. When American engineers from the 5th Battalion, 20th Infantry tried to push into the quarter on the 14th of February, 2007, they lost 2 vehicles and 4 men in the first 300 meters. The lead engineer squad hit a pressure plate on a curb. The vehicle sent to recover them hit a secondary device buried in the same alley. Both incidents occurred inside 7 minutes. When elements of the 2nd Cavalry tried again in May, the breach point was itself rigged. A Bradley went up in an alley that had been walked by their own dismounts 4 hours earlier. 3 killed, 7 wounded. The alley itself remained impassable for the rest of the week, because recovering the wreck would have required engineers to move under observation through at least 4 other positions that were themselves believed to be rigged. They left the Bradley. Part of it was still there on the 9th of October. The 3rd attempt was in August. It did not produce a casualty count because it was aborted before contact. A company-sized element moved to the edge of the northern grid, lost a drone inside the first block to something American intelligence could not identify on the wreckage, and was ordered back. The company commander wrote in his post-action report that he considered the grid saturated beyond any density he had encountered in 2 prior deployments. The phrase, "saturated beyond any density," was underlined twice in the signed copy. By the end of August, Colonel Heston had closed the district. Not formally. There was no order declaring the quarter off-limits. What there was a red hatched area on the Joint Operations Overlay that was understood across the task force to mean one thing. Nothing friendly moved there. Nothing friendly was going to move there. Whatever lived in that grid was going to stay there until an Iraqi army brigade could be stood up to take it block by block, which was, at the pace of training in the fall of 2007, probably a 6-month proposition. That was the situation when the proposal reached Heston's desk for the first time. It was a single-page document, 4 paragraphs, signed at the bottom by a British major whose name appeared on the signature line in ink that was unusually neat. The major's name was Andrew Redfern. Redfern was 34 years old. He had come to Iraq twice before, once in 2003, once in 2005, and he had been in the regiment for 11 years, which was long enough that he was no longer remarked upon inside his own squadron. Outside it, which is to say in the American task force he was now attached to, he was remarked upon very little at all. He rarely spoke at briefings. He sat along the wall. On the morning the proposal reached Heston, Redfern was walking a 400-meter circuit around the edge of a wheat field, 2 kilometers east of the Black Quarter, counting the number of civilians who crossed a specific dirt track between 0600 and 0900. It was the 4th morning he had done it. The proposal on Heston's desk was, by design, the least ambitious document Redfern could write. It did not ask for authorization to clear the district. It did not ask for a company or a Bradley or a single American asset. It asked for permission for 4 men to conduct a single foot entry along a specific route over the course of a single night, to observe one named building and then withdraw. No engagement, no demolition, no extraction of persons, observation only. Heston read it once and wrote 3 words across the top in blue ink. Denied. Too risky. Colonel Bradley Heston was 48 years old. He had commanded a tank company in Desert Storm at the age of 32. He had commanded a battalion during the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003 and had been the youngest officer in V Corps to receive a Silver Star during that phase of the war. He was careful, precise, widely respected by his staff, and regarded inside the task force as the kind of commander who did not get men killed for no reason. The American officers who had served under him, and would serve under him again, used a specific word about him: reliable. His blind spot, if it can be called that, and whether it can be called a blind spot is a question the official record does not resolve, was a particular conviction about what constituted preparation. For Heston, preparation was the set of things an American battalion could do with its own assets: rehearsals, route reconnaissance, drone coverage, engineer survey. Preparation was visible. It was measurable. It generated documents. When Heston looked at the Black Quarter, he did not see a district that had resisted preparation. He saw a district that had defeated preparation. He did not believe there was a further category of preparation available to him beyond the one he had already tried. He did not believe, to put it precisely, that a man walking a wheat field 4 mornings in a row and counting civilians at a dirt track was doing preparation at all. That was the condition when the second proposal came in. The second was the one that produced the briefing. The briefing was held on the morning of the 1st of August, 2007, in the main ops room at FOB Warhorse, starting at 0930. 14 officers were present. The room was lit by overhead fluorescents and one window facing east, whose blinds were shut. On the table, in the center, was a laminated street map of northern Bakuba, with the 14-block grid outlined in a heavy red pencil line that had been drawn over at various times by 3 different hands. Heston sat at the head of the table. To his right, his operations officer, Major Chris Langley, 38, who had served under him in Mosul in 2004. To his left, an intelligence officer from the Brigade S2, whose name, in the version of the meeting log recovered later, appears only as Captain K. Along the far wall, in 3 chairs, sat the British liaison officer, Major Redfern, and 2 staff sergeants from his element, whose names are redacted in the unclassified copy, but were entered in full in the original. Heston opened the meeting by reading the Redfern proposal aloud. He read it slowly. When he reached the paragraph requesting permission for 4 men to enter the grid on foot, he paused. Then he said, without looking up, and clearly enough that everyone in the room heard every word, "Nothing can survive in there." He said it twice. The second time he looked at Redfern when he said it. The reaction around the table was recorded in the informal account that Langley wrote down that evening in a personal notebook, which, by the accidents of paperwork, survived the war. 3 of the 14 officers smiled. 2 looked at the table. Captain K, from the S2, frowned and wrote something in the margin of his copy of the agenda. Major Langley, according to his own note, felt the room close slightly and did not say anything. Major Redfern nodded once. He did not argue. He did not request a reconsideration. He thanked the colonel for his time and, when the meeting was adjourned a further 9 minutes later, left the room in the company of his 2 NCOs and returned to the outer compound where their quarters were. On the morning that followed, Redfern was back at the wheat field. What nobody in the briefing room had discussed that morning, because nobody at the task force level yet had the granular reporting to raise it, was who was inside the Black Quarter. The name that eventually closed the file on the district was Abu Dari al-Samarai. He was 41 years old. He was not, by any conventional measure, the most famous operational figure active in Diyala province in the autumn of 2007. The figures whose names the American press reported were different men. What Abu Dari was, according to 3 separate intelligence streams that were only partially corroborating each other in the summer of 2007, and here the record does not fully agree on which stream came first, was the planner responsible for the specific pattern of IED deployment that had closed the northern quarter of Bakba in the first place. He had, over the preceding 15 months, built the thing that was keeping the Americans out. He lived inside it. He coordinated from inside it. He moved inside it the way a man moves through a building whose layout he had personally designed. He had survived a targeting raid in Samara in early 2006. He had survived 2 airstrikes in May and July of that year, including one that killed his driver and 2 guards in a moving vehicle. He had, by the assessment of the S2 cell, not slept in the same house for more than 3 consecutive nights at any point in the 14 months before October of 2007. In the assessment of the same cell, Abu Dhari's removal would not clear the grid in itself. The devices would remain. The men who operated them would remain. But the intelligence product Abu Dhari ran, the one that decided where each device went and which routes were opened and closed on a given week, would stop. And a grid whose pattern stopped updating in the view of the S2 cell became a grid that could be cleared block by block within 90 days. The removal of Abu Dhari was, in short, the condition on which the Black Quarter could be reopened. It was also, by Heston's framework, impossible. That contradiction did not get argued out at briefing level because nobody raised it at briefing level. Redfern submitted a revised proposal on the 14th of August. Denied. He submitted a third on the 29th. Denied. The denial on the 3rd was verbal, relayed through Langley, and it contained the observation that a 4th submission would not be considered, which, from Redfern's perspective, answered his remaining administrative question. The Americans were not going to authorize the operation through any conventional channel. The permission structure he was operating within had closed. What was left was the permission structure he was not operating within. Worth noting, at this point, what the regiment's standing arrangement with the American task force actually permitted. The arrangement was broad. It permitted British elements attached to the task force to conduct operations jointly approved by the British chain of command and the American tactical commander, which is the permission Heston had denied. It also permitted, in language that had been written into the attachment order and never removed, independent British operations in support of the task force's broader mission. That second clause had been intended to cover things like liaison visits, source meetings, minor reconnaissance. It had not been intended to cover a 4-man foot entry into a closed grid. Redfern read it 4 times on the evening of the 30th of August. He did not request clarification. On the morning of the 31st, he was back at the wheat field. The preparation began in the formal record on the 1st of September, 2007. In practice, it had begun in mid-July. What Redfern had been doing in the field east of the grid, in sets of 3 to 4 mornings at a time, was building a baseline. Civilian movement patterns. The times certain tracks were used, and the times they were not. The position of a particular shepherd whose flock grazed to within 200 meters of the northeastern corner of the quarter, and who, over the course of a week's observation, turned out to be moving on a schedule that was calibrated to avoid something. What the shepherd was avoiding, in Redfern's assessment, was the devices, which meant the shepherd knew where the devices were, which meant if the shepherd could be approached quietly and paid and asked the right questions in the right language by somebody who was not American, the devices had a map. Redfern did not approach the shepherd himself. One of his staff sergeants, a 32-year-old whose field Arabic was strong enough to be mistaken for Levantine, did. It took 4 meetings spread across 10 days. The shepherd did not give the regiment a map. He gave them, in the manner these things are given, a sequence of yes and no answers that allowed them to build one. The thing to understand about that exchange is that neither side wrote anything down. The map existed in the shepherd's head, and from the 14th of September it existed in the staff sergeant's head, and then, on a piece of squared paper inside a folder in Redfern's locker, it existed on paper, but only in a form a man who had not been there would not be able to read. By the 20th of September, Redfern had a diagram of the northeastern approach to the Black Quarter that was more detailed than anything American engineering had produced in a year. By the 25th, he had been through the first 3 blocks of the grid himself, on foot, twice in the early hours of the morning, moving alone. The second time, he took a photograph of a specific intersection he wanted his patrol to cross and walked back out the way he had come in. He did not report this. He did not log it. He did not enter the photograph into any system that Heston's task force had access to. The photograph was taped to the inside of a folder Redfern kept in his locker. The folder had a handwritten label on the front, in the same neat ink the Langley notebook would later record as Redfern's, that read the single word, route. By the first week of October, the route folder contained 17 items, 4 photographs, 3 pencil diagrams, a handwritten timing sheet for the pattern of movement through the first 6 blocks, 2 pages of notes from the shepherd's answers, 3 pages of notes on the specific building that was believed to house Abu Dari, a 2-page summary written to be shown, if necessary, to a British general and nobody else. On the 7th of October, Redfern briefed his 3 men. The briefing took 11 minutes. The patrol departed the outer wire at 20:47 on the 8th of October. 4 men on foot. Standard kit, plus 2 sets of boot covers, plus 1 small audio recorder, plus a single pair of wire cutters that belonged to the shepherd and had been returned to the regiment's possession 3 days earlier with a specific instruction about which wire they were to be used on and which wire they were not. They moved east for 1,200 meters through open ground. Redfern had now walked more than 20 times. At 21:34, they entered the grid. Inside the grid, the patrol did not move the way a patrol moves. They moved the way a man moves, who has been here before. The first 3 blocks took them 41 minutes. They passed within 6 meters of an IED position the shepherd had marked, crossed a street the American engineering report had flagged as an unrecoverable kill zone, and stopped once, briefly, when a dog somewhere 2 streets south began barking, and then stopped. At 22:15, they were within 1 street of the house. And then they stopped. The house was dark. They watched it for 20 minutes from the second-story room of a collapsed bakery that Redfern had used on his second visit. Nobody entered. Nobody left. A generator that had been running every other night they had reconnoitered was off. At 22:35, the staff sergeant who had met the shepherd indicated that he did not think their man was in the building. Redfern did not respond for approximately 2 minutes, during which none of the 4 men moved or spoke, and the only sound in the room was the wind moving a strip of metal sheeting against a beam somewhere above them. Then he said quietly, "We wait." They waited 3 hours. What happened during those 3 hours is, for obvious reasons, not in any published account, and the sergeant who wrote the internal after-action report for the regiment wrote only that the patrol maintained overwatch without incident. Which is to say, what the 4 men did and did not do and thought and did not think during those 3 hours in the upper room of a collapsed bakery inside the grid Colonel Heston had closed, is not a matter of public record and is not likely to become one. What can be confirmed is that at 01:47 on the 9th of October, a small Toyota pickup entered the street from the north, stopped in front of the target building for less than 20 seconds, and departed. A man had stepped out. The man had entered the building. The generator had come on at 01:51. Abu Dari was home. The patrol crossed the street at 02:18. They entered through the courtyard, which Redfern had established was unwatched between 0200 and 0245. The side door was unlocked. It had been unlocked every time Redfern had observed it. On the ground floor, two men, asleep. They were not the target. The patrol moved past them without waking them and went up the stairs. Abu Dari was in a room at the back of the first floor. He was not asleep. He was reading by the light of a single overhead bulb from a stack of papers on a low table in front of him. When the door opened, he turned his head, saw the four men in the doorway, and understood correctly that he had perhaps a second and a half to make a decision. He put his hands on the table. The staff sergeant who had met the shepherd spoke to him in Arabic, 6 words. Abu Dari did not answer. He did not need to. He stood up. He was cable-tied at 0223. They were out of the house at 0226. They were out of the grid at 0401. They were back inside the wire at 0458. No shots fired, no devices triggered, no contact with any other element, hostile or friendly, during the entire transit. 4 men walked in. 4 men walked out. 1 additional man was brought back. The medic's examination of Redfern's patrol took 41 minutes. He recorded, in clinical language, the absence of every category of wound the form was designed to capture. Feet intact, hands intact, hearing intact. The spaces on the form where he would normally have recorded dressings applied, medications administered, evacuation required, he left blank. At the bottom of the form, in the section reserved for additional remarks, he wrote 1 line. It was a departure from protocol. Nobody asked him to remove it. The line read, "No injuries observed, consistent with no contact." By 0530, Abu Dari had been transferred to the task force detention facility. By 0600, the S2 cell had begun exploiting the papers he had been reading at the moment of capture, which included, among other items, a hand-drawn diagram of the exact IED placement pattern for the northern grid, updated to the 6th of October. Colonel Heston read the initial after-action report at 0840 on the 9th of October. He read it alone in his office, with the door closed. He was seen, shortly afterwards, walking the length of the ops room corridor without speaking to anyone he passed. What he said that morning, if he said anything, is not recorded. What is recorded is that the second copy of the report, which was circulated to the senior staff at 1100, was the first point at which the language of the operation became formal. The language referred to a British element conducting an independent reconnaissance mission in support of task force objectives. It did not mention the Black Quarter by name. It did not reference the briefing of the 1st of August. It did not contain the words that had closed that briefing. It did not need to. The grid opened on the 24th of October. By the 20th of November, American engineers had moved into the first 6 blocks without a casualty. By the 12th of December, the full 14-block quarter had been cleared. The red hatching came off the Joint Operations Overlay in the first week of the new year. On the laminated street map that had sat in the center of the ops room table on the morning of the 1st of August, the 14-block grid remained outlined in heavy red pencil for another 73 days. At some point in mid-December, the map was taken off the table, rolled, and filed. The pencil line was never rubbed out. It was simply put away. 9 weeks after the meeting, 4 men had walked through the red line on foot at night and back out again. None of them had been wounded. None of them had fired a shot. None of them was named in the report, in the after-action, in the citation that was not written, or in any document that the American chain of command circulated between the 9th of October and the end of the war. The numbers, as they stood at 05:30 on the morning of the 9th, were these: 9 months, 3 prior operations, 12 American killed in action inside the grid, 1 Bradley left in place, 0 clearance progress as of 0000 on the 9th of October, 4 men, 1 night, 0 casualties, 0 shots, 1 prisoner. The map went back in the tube. The pencil line was still on it.